Hello and welcome to COS Today, as we bring you Roundtable. The Roundtable segment is presented here every fourth Monday of the month at 7 p.m. We'll be focusing on education and discussion of the topics and challenges we all face as we use the Constitution to save the Constitution. Join us now as we bring you COS Today's Roundtable with our MC, John Ackerman.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our roundtable. And our host, John Ackerman. John, are you ready to go? Folks, I think we're having a bit of a...
Well, I was waiting for Mike to finish talking. Welcome to Convention of States Today Roundtable. I'm your host, John Ackerman, and our topic is the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Now, a year ago this month, Uri Berliner, a veteran of National Public Radio, published an article called, "I've been at NPR for 25 years. Here's how we lost America's trust." And the publishing of that article led to his departure from NPR. So tonight, we're going to take a deep dive into the issues surrounding NPR and PBS, both of which are owned and operated by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. For those who don't know, NPR is a radio network and PBS is a television network. Both have gone woke, both have lost the confidence of the American people, and both just might be on the chopping block to lose federal funding. So I'm going to turn to our panelist, Gary Harbaugh, and ask him to tell us when and why the Corporation for Public Broadcasting was formed.
Thanks, John. Interesting history about this. I'm going to go way back, actually, to predate the founding of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting by several years. So in the 1950s, there was a Democratic activist who was involved heavily in politics in Chicago, heavily supported JFK. And in 1961, he was appointed to be the chairman of the Federal Communications Commission. His name was Newton Minow. And I think this was probably a reward for supporting, the Democrat Party in particular, and Kennedy especially, in that election. So shortly after he was appointed, and there was some controversy because although he was a telecommunications lawyer, he had no background or experience, particularly in the field of radio or television. And so the Federal Communications Commission primarily regulated at that time radio and television and licensing the spectrum and so forth. So it's a little bit weird to pick a guy who really didn't have experience in that industry. But in 1961, Newton Minow gave a speech to the National Association of Broadcasters in which he referred to commercial television as a vast wasteland. That term really caught a lot of people's attention. A vast wasteland was considered too much violence and frivolity. And if we look back at that, you probably remember some of the shows then popular, maybe Gunsmoke, Bonanza, Father Knows Best, Leave It to Beaver. this is the stuff that he thought was frivolous and too much violence, which is shocking. We look back at that as very wholesome television by comparison. But anyway, he called commercial television a vast wasteland. And this really kicked off the push to get government funding of the media. And you can argue, as many might, that this was a way to get government propaganda, funded in the media, radio and television. So it took until 1967 for the passage of a law creating the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, signed into law in November of 67 by Lyndon Johnson. Corporation really got started in 1968. Funding was shaky and so forth. And our good friend Fred Rogers, the infamous Mr. Rogers, testified before Congress in support of funding for the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. This really got it kind of kicked off. And the idea was it was going to be, wholesome, it was going to be educational and so forth. And in 1979, a law was passed to supposedly insulate the Corporation for Public Broadcasting from any kind of political influence. And interestingly enough, this in part was, I think, a reflection of the fact that Richard Nixon, as president, was very critical of PBS and the way he was treated, he felt, wrongly by public television. And so, Yuri Berliner says, wow, until 10 years ago, Corporation for Public Broadcasting was right down the middle. But I think if you look back at the history, you can see that the Corporation for Public Broadcasting has never been diverse in the sense of favoring conservatism. And so PBS in the 80s created the McNeil-Lehrer Report. In the 1990s, they went bilingual, 2000, Native American programming. And what you see throughout the history is that their idea, they funded a lot of things that were really, we would consider fringe, I think, to try to mainstream things that were fringe. And the Democrats, their idea of diversity is bringing fringe things into the mainstream, but they're always fringe woke type things. They're never a diversity of real political opinion. Everything, if you have a corporation that funds things and it gets its money from the government, it's always going to favor bigger government, more government. And so that's really what you see. And the grants that have put emphasis on, especially starting around 2010, big emphasis on diversity and that sort of thing. So the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, I think, was created as a way to get government funded, propaganda really into the mainstream of media.
Okay, thank you, Gary. Now, the radio half of that thing is called NPR, National Public Radio. And I'm going to turn to our panelist, Dale Tipton, and ask Dale to talk with us about how NPR changed since its founding. Dale?
You're muted,
Dale, I believe you're muted.
Yeah, Dale shut my mic off, rascal. So I wanted to take a little bit of Gary's comment there about hiring somebody to get into this thing and to lead it that wasn't fully qualified, because I was of the opinion that Hunter Biden dramatically proved that you didn't have to have expertise in the particular line of employment that you chose. So I just wanted to throw that out there. But thinking back, John, as we started to kind of study this, I was kind of thinking back, 1970, I graduated from high school in 1973. And I can remember riding around with like parents, and you had your presets on the radio and all of that kind of thing. And I'm pretty confident that they had NPR, the local NPR station, as one of the presets. And so my dad was a farmer. And so there were some things on there that he thought he could relate to. I mean, there was some basic content about, things that related to farmers and just kind of life in general, whether it was the cost of groceries or whatever that they did these specials on. And I can also remember that they were fantastic at sound effects. I'd never listened to a place before. If you did a story about cicadas that were coming out this year, you would hear those things and you would think they were like in the car with you. I mean, it was just that good. The same thing with like tree frogs in the Amazon or, whatever else. These guys were just masters at these sound effects and piping them into their programming, which made it really cool. But all along, they've probably been bent a little left. I'll just say that. Not hard left. And it wasn't a left bent that was, the kind of thing that rubbed you the wrong way if you happen to be a conservative or a middle of the road independent. That you still had your views that were out there. And just to quote some statistics from Mr. Berliner, back in 2011, the NPR's audience, although it tilted slightly to the left, it bore a resemblance to what America was at large. 26% of listeners described themselves as conservative, 23% as middle of the road, and 37% as liberal. And so between the conservatives and the middle of the road folks, I mean, that was, they had the majority actually. And so the programming kind of reflected that, and people were, although it had started to turn, I mean, things were still pretty good. So jump forward to 2023. The picture was completely different. Only 11% then described themselves as very or somewhat conservatives, 21% as middle of the road, and 67% of listeners said they were very or somewhat liberal. And so by 2023, things had just totally changed. And what you basically saw was the overwhelming content of woke programming that was coming to the, to the fore there. And so conservatives and some middle of the road independents and even some liberals were starting to turn it off, because NPR, as we know it today, does not look like America. It basically follows the thought process of the elites on either coast, and that's kind of the viewpoint that goes forward. And in some of the recent congressional hearings, as we were talking about this stuff, I think I remember hearing that out of 87 leaders within NPR and National Public Radio, that whole thing, 87 people were looked at, and they all voted Democratic. Now, I'm not saying that has anything to do with it, but it certainly might. And obviously, over time, the people that were hired to run the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and NPR favored one philosophy as far as politics goes, and that's the liberal philosophy. And as those hirings continued, and the people on top wanted to hire more people that were like them, and pretty soon, the whole thing is basically running along, and they're all thinking with the same brain, which impacts greatly the type of programming that they had, and that's where we are today. And so the question arises, why keep giving them money? They no longer represent America, so here we are.
Yeah, it looks like they might be on the chopping block. Dale, I see your hand.
Yeah, John, do you all think, I'm thinking back in the early days, like Gary was saying, and in the 60s and even Dale in the 70s, do you think did we at that time, did we even know that everything was kind of skewed left? I think of in the early days when I started watching the news, when you had Walter Cronkite and some of the main people of the day. I thought they were telling us the truth. I didn't know that what was left or right. Do you think many people felt that way back at that time?
That's a good point, Dale. That's actually something I'm going to touch on in my segment.
It's hard.
Go ahead, John.
Okay. And it's hard to tell, but, as a young adult, I certainly didn't feel that way. I started to have a growing awareness of that in the 80s and 90s, I think. So it's a good question, Dale. Yeah.
I'll be very. This
Well,
just came
I
to
want
my
to tell
mind.
you, if you're watching,
We're
okay,
not
I want to
having a
speak to
good
the
connection.
audience. If
Go ahead.
you're, yeah, if you're watching live on Facebook or YouTube, you can ask questions or make comments by typing in the comment box there. And our faithful servant, Ken Kashuba, is going to keep an eye on all that stuff. And Ken, do you have anything to post so far this early in the program?
Not so far, John. I think we have a bit of a lag
Okay.
in it.
Well, Ken, while you're on the mic there, why don't you talk
Let
to
me
us about the QR code that's just above Gary's head over there, okay?
Sure, we'll take a break and talk a little bit about that QR card. Maybe the internet will give us a little less jet lag for those that are listening. That QR code is a support QR code, basically a way to show your support for COS Today and programs like tonight's Roundtable. So if you just get your smartphone out and take a shot of that, it'll ask you for your name and email address. It'll bring you to a platform where you can join others who are supporting our efforts here in getting contributor segments and other types of great information and educational resources. So it's a matter of hitting that QR code up and just signing in to show your support.
Okay, that's very good. Thank you, Ken. Now I'm going to turn to Brett Sturley and ask when NPR went off the rails. Okay, Brett.
Well, thank you, John. Yeah, we've talked about that just a little bit, and that's one thing that Yuri Berliner said in his 2024 article, that he had recently noticed that NPR's liberal bent had become more intolerant of dissenting opinions, and obviously his dissenting opinion was, he learned that firsthand because that article ended up with his suspension and finally firing from NPR. And I think that might have been the time where he actually noticed the change finally, but the trend began years earlier. And like what Dale Parrish had mentioned, I grew up watching Walter Cronkite, David Brinkley, Sam Donaldson, these network personalities, and they were all, if you look at their political leanings, they were all liberal. But what they were able to do is they were able to have the craft of their seriousness of journalism and their craft of journalism override much of their bias, to where the biases were largely hid from the audience. And that was one thing that, journalism was more of a profession, I believe, back then. And now it's turned into more of crafting a narrative instead of just reporting the news, reporting the facts, and telling stories and letting the audience interpret for themselves. I think it's a lot more of an advancement for our narrative, and we'll have a couple of good examples of that here coming up. So if you look back, I was trying to figure out, what exactly, because I didn't really watch PBS. I watched Sesame Street, which, and that's one thing that, Sesame Street was the only profitable standalone program on public broadcasting. And other than that, I was trying to figure out what else I'd watched, and I was a little bit young. I was a little young in the early days of watching Firing Line, which was hosted by William F. Buckley from 1966 to 1999. I did watch some of the episodes back through in the later 80s and some in the 90s. And William F. Buckley was considered the father of the modern conservative movement. He was a very bright intellectual, had very, very sharp but dry sense of humor, and there were several different personalities on Firing Line. I would encourage you to go back and watch some of those old episodes, and just watch the intellectual discussions they had gotten into. there, and it was really, they were really in depth and thought provoking. And Buckley was a very, very strong personality. So any leftward bent that was on that program, Buckley was pretty well able to single-handedly counterbalance. And Firing Line, William F. Buckley stopped hosting in 1999, and it continued until with various hosts until 2020. But those various hosts gradually became more and more liberal and more open with their liberal attitude, and that's kind of going, kind of coinciding with the with the history of where they started to lose their audience and started to lose their objectivity for sure. And obviously, this is all just going into warp speed since Donald Trump came down the golden escalator in Trump Tower. And it's ironic because Donald Trump spent much of his life as a registered Democrat. And civil rights grifters like Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton, pandered to him on a regular basis to try to fund their pet projects and their organizations. I mean, Donald Trump received awards from the NAACP for advancing minority rights in recognition of him working in the minority community, which is really ironic that you hear the way that they talk about the same person now, and you would just, it's really difficult to draw that line from then to now. And I would say he's just largely broken their minds, and they're just not capable of linear thought here anymore. But it's just been fascinating to watch that. And when you get into some examples here, NPR largely ignored the actual news, like the Hunter Biden laptop story that was originally broken by the New York, I think the New York, was that the Post? I believe it was the New York Post.
Yeah, I think so.
And in internal memos actually in NPR that have been released alluded to the story, and they were actually cited in Yuri Berliner's article, his article. Internal memos actually alluded to the story that they believed internally at the higher echelon of NPR that the story was legitimate, but they were worried that if they actually covered it, that story objectively, that the story might help President Donald Trump get elected, which obvious bias right there. They also embraced the false Russian collusion claims. And I assume, using the same logic, that hoax was seen as possibly being damaging to Donald Trump. And of course, when we get to 2020 and since, NPR has been just really loyal foot soldiers for the government's COVID-19 narrative and ignored the actual data demonstrating the lies and the total mismanagement of that episode. And that continues to today. And when I was thinking about this in studying, the history of NPR, that kind of struck me as being ironic, because actually reporting the truth and the actual data could be tied to President Trump's decision in March of 2020 to effectively hand over the final year of his first term of his presidency over to Tony Fauci, Deborah Birx, and Francis Collins. They were the experts, the science. And so it's interesting that to me, that would be potentially damaging to President Trump, but yet they have not done that. And I would say that probably following the money might bear out why that might be. And as Dale Tipton pointed out, NPR's viewership decidedly moved. It was a lot more balanced back in the early 2010s, and by 2023, now it's just, blatantly liberal and left leaning. And this is really the same movement we've seen in other legacy media, as audiences increasingly move toward their ideological echo chambers. And you really see that that's where the legacy media really lashes out at podcasts, at alternative media platforms. And NPR, as it stands today, it continues the ideological bias rather than objectively reporting the news and allowing consumers to decide. And this is the same as other legacy media platforms. And the attack has been, well, you want to defund public broadcasting, and this is really a valuable commodity for the airwaves. Well, if that's the case, it should be able to stand on its own. The issue is that it receives so much taxpayer funding. Now, NPR, just to get to the kind of following the money a little bit, NPR claims that claims publicly that they only receive 1% of their total funding from the federal government. And for fiscal year 2020, this is according to NPR. Once you dig behind the numbers, the broadcasters' affiliate stations received 8% of their revenue from the federal appropriations via the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
Yeah.
So those are also federal taxpayer fund. Well, they're not federal funds, or taxpayer funds. They also receive about 10% of their funding from colleges and universities, which themselves are publicly funded, and another 5% from federal, state, and local governments. So that's a total of 23%, not 1%. And that's via an article on NPR in Corporation for Public Broadcasting by the Western Journal. If you look at PBS, will actually itself says it receives 15% of its revenue from the federal government, 13% from the state governments, and 3% from local government, and 8% from universities. That's a total of 39%. So there is just a massive amount of taxpayer money that goes to fund what is basically a state-run network that we would say, just like what Gary said, Pravda in Russia, any of these state-run, Al Jazeera in Saudi Arabia, any of these state-run media outlets, they're going to go where they get their money. They get their money, a large bulk of their money, from the federal government. So it's just natural human behavior that they're going to lean towards the government narrative and be biased in favor of the government and away from the truth. And that's where we are today.
Yeah. It's the old wisdom in 3 words: follow the money. If you just follow the money, you see where the ideas come from and so on. So I want to thank you for that, Brett. That's very good insight there. And just another fact that I want to throw in there, along with the leftward shift of the audience of both NPR and PBS, that has taken place over recent years, but also the size of their audience has shrunk. Fewer and fewer people are tuning in because of all the good alternative media sources that are available today, like podcasts and upstart networks. And so we're going to take a little break right now, and we're going to have an episode of Dave's Daily Dose. Let's see what Dave has to say to us this week.
Hang on to your hats, boys and girls. The earth just moved. Either NPR just hired a guy and he doesn't know the drill, the ins and outs, the ups and downs, who to keep off the air and who to make sure stays on, or something else. What can this mean? This is Dave's Daily Dose on Broken Road Radio. I'm David Allen Punt. I was tooling down the highway last night on my way home to supper. The missus has whipped up with her own 2 hands. Well, last night was frozen lasagna night, a new item we picked up from Trader Joe's. We'd never tried their frozen lasagna and figured, how bad could it be? Most of their food is pretty good, but lasagna? We just hadn't tried it before. And it wasn't too bad. Wasn't as good as the stuff that the missus whips up from scratch, but then again, what is? So I'm tooling along the byway listening to the doom and gloom on NPR, and it's been doomier and gloomier of late for the last 3 months or so, actually ever since the election, so that's more like the last 5 months. Orange man bad, And there's this story on the economy, more specifically on tariffs and university money being withheld. Actually, it's my money that the universities are getting through the fingertips of my government. Most people don't think about it that way, especially the folks at universities. They think it's their money and always has been. But I'm here to tell him it was my money first, then my government snatched it up through the IRS, and then it went to the Department of Education, and then it went to various and sundry universities. And all sorts of economic professors are wailing and ranting and raving and gnashing teeth, predicting that the Trump tariffs will bring the world down to its ankles, and woe is us, and it's all over, and you may not be able to see the end of the world, but if you stand on your tiptoes, you can see the edge. And then the announcer said they had one more professor to talk to in this particular story, just one more. And I said, I can take one more. I've got the lasagna to look forward to, and we'll probably have red wine with it, so bring it on. One more professor. And this professor said, Trump is doing the right thing. Countries the world over have been eating our lunch for decades, and Trump is leveling the playing field, and it's going to be really good when it's over. And this professor said the story, no doubt, had included all these other professors wailing away, and these professors were definitely lefties and didn't know what they were talking about. Whoa! I checked the dash to make sure I still had the radio tuned to National Public Radio. It was. What gives? Two possibilities. The new hire I mentioned earlier screwed up and is on his way out, or someone at NPR is thinking that now that the feds are looking into public broadcasting and making sure they're running their public announcements that sound like commercials the correct way. And maybe it's both. I'm David Allen Punt.
Oh, that was good.
That was pretty good, wasn't it?
Yeah, I like that, and very timely. Fits right into our topic this week. Dale.
Yeah, this comment is directed toward Gary and Dale and Brett. I can't get over, quite honestly, thinking back to the people that influenced me as far as the news and so forth. I know Buckley was a major player in the conservative movement and had a great influence on, I'm sure, on public broadcasting and everything. But for me, I have to admit, Rush Limbaugh had tremendous influence on me personally. And that's when, in listening to Rush, it seems to me that's when I really started listening to legacy news and started looking for alternative news outlets. That's what really opened my eyes to the left slant that some of the, like the Donaldsons and the Cronkites and so forth, had always presented. Did Rush influence anyone else? Any of you other people in the same way? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, for me, it was absolutely that. Rush was one of the few people that it seemed like that I could listen to at that point that you really feel like he gave you an education. He taught you something. You knew more after an hour with Rush than you did, beforehand. And those were my days of being in a car a lot, working for the government and doing what I was doing. And I think he came on at like 11 o'clock. And if I had anything to do that involved driving, I was in the car at 11 o'clock, so that I could get as much Rush in as I could, so I wouldn't miss it. But yeah, he was outstanding. And he referenced Buckley and what a great guy Buckley was. But Buckley didn't influence. All of Buckley's influence came to me through Rush. Yeah. Right.
But I recall Rush, I felt was taught me what to look for. And I think he even focused on NPR and from time to time. I mean, he actually talked about how left it was at NPR, and so I think he had a big influence on.
Okay, Brett.
No, I think you're right, Dale. And I listened to Rush an awful lot, and saw his Rush to Excellence tours. And I think the big thing is that when he spoke, he was entertaining, but we were always told that, conservatives are the silent majority, that we're just sitting here in the corner, and we're just, we clutch our pearls whenever we hear things that don't go, that are anti-constitutional. And Rush was just, he would name the frauds, and then he would say, here's how they're frauds. And he would just boldly and confidently, profess and spread the conservative message. And that was the one thing that I think it meant to me and so many people, is that, wow, you know what? Maybe I'm not the oddball. Maybe I'm not the oddball that, thinks that we should have limited government and we should have lower taxes. We have a strong defense. We should have secure borders. Maybe, that's exactly, and it's really spurred my interest in looking back and going back through and reading the Federalist Papers, reading the Anti-Federalist Papers, and really delving into some of the history of our country. And just, it's funny, I've got, if I was in my office at the house, back on my bookshelf, I have his 2 books. His first one, The Way Things Ought to Be.
Yeah.
What a great title.
Yeah.
And then, See, I Told You So. And this was just the way that he confidently just encouraged conservatives to say, look, we're right. This is the right worldview. This is the godly and the moral worldview. Be proud of it. And that's really helped give me a voice through politics and my own podcast, and then also through my volunteer with Convention of States. So I think, plus he resurrected AM radio. AM radio was dead, and he single-handedly resurrected. And we don't have Sean Hannity, we don't have Mark Levin, we don't have Ben Shapiro, we don't have Glenn Beck, we don't have any of these personalities, more than likely, without Rush Limbaugh. So absolutely, God bless him.
I think he did spur a lot of other outlets to come to the forefront. Yes.
Yeah.
He really changed the landscape. Gary, you got something?
Yeah, I was going to say Rush Limbaugh, in some sense, was William F. Buckley for dummies. William F. Buckley, brilliant guy, but the man on the street was not going to listen to his arguments. He was way too intellectual for most people. And Rush Limbaugh had this gift of not only being educational, but being entertaining in the way he presented things. And, he just boldly called out the left the way Buckley would have, but he did it in a not only entertaining, but engaging in ways that made you like him as a person and his ideas. And he was a once in a 1,000-year kind of guy, just an amazingly influential man that we're fortunate to have had him.
Yes, indeed. And don't forget, he was also pretty funny. And so I enjoyed listening to him for all those reasons. And like Dale Tipton, I kind of timed some of my road trips so I'd be on the road during that 3-hour window, Monday through Friday, when Rush was on the air. And I found his first 15 to 20 minutes each hour was the most informative. Right. Before he started taking phone calls, just his monologues were great. Yeah. And always right on. And so here we are. Well, let's go. We've looked at when and why the Corporation for Public Broadcasting was formed, how NPR changed over the years, and when it really went off the rails. And now I want to turn to Ken Kashuba and ask Ken to take a deep dive into what NPR did during COVID. What was their COVID coverage like, Ken?
Just before we get into that, John, we do have a couple of comments I want to address because we were talking about personalities and Rush, and we have one of our viewers that brought up a couple of comments. So I'm going to flash these up here because maybe some of you know better than I, even on some of these people that were there. Baxter talks about, he wondered what happened to Bob Edwards. He said he co-anchored All Things Considered in the early days and began hosting Morning Edition in 1979. But he was promoted to a senior correspondent. He goes on to say, but then that was 2004, his 24 and a half years anniversary. He believes Rush was the reason NPR moved more left. Anybody have any comments on that?
Interesting.
That is
Never-
interesting. Yeah.
Never thought about that.
Yeah. So
Yeah,
anyway,
that's really good. Well, you remember that Bill Clinton, whenever Rush was tearing into Bill Clinton, that's what he always said. There wasn't a truth detector, out there, and I always and again, Rush said, "I'm the truth detector."
Yeah.
And so I just thought that was just great. He just threw it right back at Bill Clinton. But I think that's interesting. That could very well be part of
Yeah, I
it.
think the comment makes a lot of sense because Rush, it didn't take him, once he got rolling, he had a huge megaphone. And I think there wasn't anybody else that was even close to him. So I can see the people on the opposite side going, well, what do we have to counter this? And NPR was probably the weapon. So I think that makes that's a great observation.
Right.
Mhm.
thank you, Baxter. Well,
Yep.
to pick up where John introduced the COVID portion, let me start by first saying I think we've all seen at times, especially in the last two or 3 years, where the left comes out with the word of the week. Whatever the word is, you can flip to a dozen different channels, and that word is used over and over and over again. And it's drilled into people's heads over and over and over again. So at the beginning of COVID, I think everybody remembers the big thing was, well, this was from a bat and out of a market in China. And the word lab was used, but it was kind of just glazed over, and not much thought given to it. And as I looked into that a little bit more, China had a role in limiting access to researchers for the World Health Organization and others that were trying to investigate this. And really what it ended up doing was it cordoned off the ability of people to get a clear sight into the lab. So it was really just kind of pushed under the rug, and even researchers were kept from getting the information they needed. So there's another gentleman named Peter Daszak, and if I butchered his name, but he's the head of this group called Eco Health Alliance. Now, he was known as an authority on pandemics and research, but he was involved in a number of ways in knocking down early in the 2020 in a letter. He helped to orchestrate the Lancet, which is a medical journal, as a source for news organizations, including NPR. And what he did, basically, he knocked down the idea that this could have leaked from a lab. But the interesting thing is his group actually helped to fund that lab. So by his group actually, helping to fund it, he had an interest in it, obviously, and in some ways in its success. And there was a number of times when NPR and other news organizations didn't acknowledge that confluence or conflicts of interest, so that we could really fully evaluate his role, even as he was shooting down the theory. So, when you look at COVID, and obviously as things really took everybody by surprise, to the most part, we were all subject to the early onslaught of science, and NPR's role in it, as you consider the repetition of things. I'm going to play a clip here, which is basically just a couple of portions from NPR, and what I want you to pay attention to is the tone, just the tone of the reporter. And then we'll come back and talk a little bit about that afterwards. But just listen to the tone, and also pay a little bit of attention to, even when things kind of come in as far as evidence of things being not what they're being told. There's never any opposite or opposite research or scientific pushback from another scientist or another expert. So let me play this clip, and then we'll come back and visit that.
Okay.
All right, look, this is just about the last thing anyone wants to hear right now, heading into our 4th year of the pandemic. But another surge in COVID cases might be on the way. Jennifer Nuzzo runs the Pandemic Center at Brown University.
We have a lot more immunity than we did last winter. Not only have people gotten vaccinated, but a lot of people have now gotten this virus. In fact, some people have gotten it multiple times. And so that does build up in the population and reduce overall our risk of severe illness.
Still, there are Omicron subvariants out there that are getting better at dodging immune systems. And while there's a booster specifically for Omicron, the vast majority of us have not gotten it yet. Fortunately, the ways we stay protected from COVID are still expanding. The FDA just made it possible for kids as young as 5 years old to get the new COVID boosters that target the Omicron variant. That's 28 million children who are now eligible. But their parents are going to take some convincing. Only a third of children under 12 have had their first 2 shots, and just 15% have had the previous booster. Jen Cates is with the Kaiser Family Foundation.
I think it's going to be a tough sell. I think there's going to be a small group of parents who are ready to go. They're anxious. It's the fall. Their kids are already getting flu and, other kinds of respiratory illnesses. So they're ready, but they're a minority of parents.
And there's doubt as to how effective the new boosters are. These bivalent COVID shots are the first ones that target 2 forms of the virus, the original strain and the Omicron variant. Paul Offit is a pediatric vaccine expert at the University of Pennsylvania who also advises the FDA.
We have, to date, no evidence that the bivalent vaccine is any better. So it's a little frustrating as we keep moving forward without evidence. Hopefully we'll be able to generate that evidence to show that the bivalent vaccine is clearly of value, but to date, those data don't exist.
Dr. Jaw recently told my colleague, Mary Louise Kelly, that there are subvariants out there that do concern him.
There are at least 3 subvariants that we're tracking very, very closely, all of which appear to have a lot more immune escape. Now, the good news about them is while they seem to do a better job of escaping immunity, they are derived from BA5 or BA2, its closely related cousin. And the new vaccines we have, which protect you against BA5, should really continue to work really quite well against these new variants. So we don't know all the details. We're studying that right now. One more reason for people to go out and get this new bivalent vaccine.
Okay, well,
Protect yourself.
Speaking of protecting ourselves, masks. At one time, there were mask mandates all over. Once they were lifted, there was not a lot of appetite to put them back on, even as various surges swept through and wreaked havoc.
Masks also clearly work. They become one more layer of protection. Mm-hmm. For me, the issue is not an issue of whether masks are important or not. They should be seen in that broader context of we have many layers of protection.
Right.
And if people want to avail themselves of all of it, then they should absolutely wear a mask. But if they choose not to wear a mask, there are other things they can do to protect themselves.
That was Dr. Ashish Jha, the White House COVID-19 response coordinator.
Well, as I mentioned, I think there were a number of things that I hope you picked up on in that. Well, there was the B2 or the B4 and how this hasn't really been researched and studied yet, but it's still good to take. Good to have. And we all know about the fact that children didn't need to be involved in any type of booster shots, yet all they talked about was getting the percentage up of children that needed to be boosted. And then lastly, of course, when I start talking about the masks, well, it's just one portion, and we all know that masks are do a good job. All right. I mean, how many of us knew early on? I mean, I'd say most people knew by 2020. I'd say, after a year or so of this, and some people doing a little more research on what comes through a mask, what goes in a mask, all that was kind of laid out. Yet NPR never mentioned anything about the study of masks, or never brought on an expert to refute the fact that masks really don't work. So why did we bother? And I'll tell you that all those recordings were in 2022. So, she mentioned early on that we'd been through 4 years. Did we not know more in 4 years than we did when it first started? I think we did. That's not what I have on COVID. And I mean, at this point, everybody get your COVID shot, just like your flu shot, once a year.
Yeah, what nonsense. Okay, I remember we did a roundtable on the jab, and it was so controversial that YouTube deleted it. Remember that? Okay,
That's right.
Dale.
That's right.
Dale, you had a comment to make?
I think both Dales. Dale,
Go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just what caught my attention was that the comment about there's a small group of parents that are really concerned, and they're getting their children ready for the upcoming school season or something. Kind of like why aren't the rest of you parents doing the same thing? Kind of that was the implication.
And that goes back to, as I mentioned early on, if you listen to the tone of that reporter, it's very in your face, and I'm telling you what you need to believe here. So
yeah,
that was the same thing that hit me. You probably heard from half a dozen different experts during that piece, and all of the experts agreed with one another. And so if you're there as a listener with a degree in accounting and you don't have any medical stuff, it's like, how do you disagree with these learned men that, are so steeped in the science of all of this, and little did any of us know that science can be kind of stretched any direction that you want to stretch it, that it's much of it's as much opinion as it is fact. So there's that.
Well, and if they truly wanted to be scientific, there would be the other side of science. But that's what science is about. Weighing two different opinions.
Yeah. You question your conclusion, and you do more research, and you test it. Okay, Brett.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, that's the scientific method. You develop a hypothesis, you form an experiment, you test it, you measure the results, and figure out whether it confirmed your hypothesis, or you need to come up with a new hypothesis. That's the scientific method. That was the whole thing that got me. And boy, I tell you, this about makes blood shoot out of my eyes when I start talking about COVID. So I'll put a governor on it, because I know that Dale will cut my mic. Dale Parrish will cut my mic. So, but that was the thing that I'm just like, you're sitting here just saying that, follow the science. I'm like, you're abandoning the scientific method. You're abandoning everything. And then when you hear from the echo chamber, you hear from the news, and they've got the Chiron down there just running death totals. This is how many people died in the last hour, and here's how many cases. And I know I don't want to get off on a tangent but no, you're exactly right. And NPR was a perfect example of the condescending attitude that, hey, you're the plebe, we're the experts. This is what you need to know. This is what you need to do. And if you don't do that, then you're an idiot and you're trying to kill somebody. And that was the one thing that kind of got me, is like, this is the first medication, whatever you want to call it, ever whose effectiveness depended upon somebody else taking it. I'm like, this doesn't make any sense. But yet it's just like, it's the propaganda, and you just hear the same thing no matter what station you turn it to, and it kind of drumbeats into the national psyche of just like, oh, I guess this is the way it's supposed to be. This is what we're supposed to do, and people should be on trial for their lives for this.
Yeah. One final image that I wanted to throw in there that I still think about it was the day I was driving on the expressway. I pull up next to another car. Here's one person in the car. You're driving 60 miles an hour. All the windows are up, and that mask is on. And I'm thinking, wow, that person has really bought and consumed the entire bucket of Kool-Aid. I mean,
you still see that today. You still see that today. From
That's an IQ test. Yeah. That's an IQ test right there.
Okay. Yeah, well, Gary?
Any real journalism would have to say, here's the argument to wear masks or to take the vaccine or whatever, and here's somebody else with the other side of the argument. But when it came to COVID, I mean, it was very clear from Fauci on down that there were no alternative discussions even permitted. And NPR fell right in line with that. And if they were real journalists, they would have put their foot down and said, no, we have to give both sides.
Yeah. So NPR really was at the forefront of the COVID hoaxes that were put over on the American public. Great report, Ken. Thank you so much for that. Well, Dale, I've asked Dale to put a nail in the coffin here, and Dale Parrish, and he's going to talk to us about why the Corporation for Public Broadcasting should be closed.
Yep. Well, John, let me bring something up here that I want everybody to take a look at. I've come up with about 10 reasons why it should be closed. Some of these we've already touched on tonight from different individuals that have been talking this evening. So, but I want to go through these, and I'll go through these very quickly. Government should not fund media. This is simply that many people believe that the government should not be in the business of funding news, media, or entertainment. And they should not be doing that in order to avoid potential conflicts of interest and censorship concerns. So that's the very first one. Second one, the budget priorities and fiscal responsibility. Simply, given the size of our national debt, it's just simply public broadcasting is just not an essential government service any longer. So that kind of money could go to much better things than, especially given the size of our debt. Now, this next one's very interesting. Media market has evolved, most certainly. Today we have, I don't know, thousands of TV channels, radio stations, news sources, and we might throw in podcasts and streaming services. Kind of like this one that we're on now, COS Today. We're part of this media market now, and we didn't exist many years ago. So the market has evolved to be much larger than it used to be. Political bias accusations. We've touched on that here this evening. Obviously, the left lean, the NPR, the public broadcasting system, does not represent really a broad spectrum of American viewpoints. So why should our taxpayer money be going to this? The next one, successful fundraising and donations. It's well known that these outlets, NPR, the public broadcasting, can raise significant money from private donations, sponsorships, foundations. So, they could very easily survive without government funding. The next one, competitive disadvantage to private media. A lot of critics argue that government-funded media competes unfairly with private media companies. So there's considered to be an unfair competitive advantage when the government's involved. Focus on entertainment over education. And this is very true. So much of public broadcasting today has really entertainment programming as opposed to educational or civic programming. So many examples of that. Redundancy over other services. And this is especially in the children's educational programming. Many alternative networks and channels can provide much of the same thing that the Corporation of Public Broadcasting offers. Number 9, local stations can survive independently, and I think that's very, very true. Many of the local public broadcasting channels and networks have developed a very, very much of a strong media presence, and they can very well survive on their own. So I think the final one, principle of voluntary support. I think basically supporters figure that the closure of the system would be very well supported throughout. So those are the 10 main reasons that I discovered to have CPB, Corporation Public Broadcasting, closed down. So,
wow, you covered the waterfront there, Dale. Thank you.
Ah.
Well, that brings us to the end of this month's roundtable. Before we close it out, I want to give you our email address. If you have any questions about Convention of States, you can email them to us at this address, raiseyourvoicecos@gmail.com. Once again, that's raiseyourvoicecos@gmail.com. And I want to invite you to tune in next Monday, May the 5th at 7 p.m., Cinco de Mayo, at 7 p.m. Eastern for our next Convention of States Today. We're going to have a discussion of the tariffs follow-up and an episode of Meet the Founders. And our next Convention of States Today roundtable will be on the 4th Monday of May. That will be May the 26th at 7 p.m. Eastern. And now I want you to take a look at episode number 13 of COS Basics, which concerns the rules of the convention. John Ackerman for Convention of States, Indiana. This is the ongoing series on COS Basics, and we're having a little fun these days busting some myths, okay? Today's myth is that there are no rules for holding a convention like this. It would be complete chaos. That's a myth. The fact is that the so-called no rules argument is meant to scare you. It's gaslighting at its finest. And again, much of this information is found on the conventionofstates.com website. A lot of this is not original with me. I'm just telling you what's on the web. Here's the fact. All the delegates to the convention will have some familiarity, at least with Robert's Rules of Order. And most of the delegates will either be legislators or attorneys, and they'll be well versed in rules of order and rules of procedure. To think that a group of legislators and attorneys wouldn't know how to conduct a convention is just absurd. Everyone there would know that you need to elect a convention chairman, for example. Everyone there would understand the concepts of making motions, amending motions, priority of motions, and on and on. Even convention opponents admit that the convention will set its own rules. So saying that there will be no rules just isn't honest. Now, there are a couple of ground rules for an Article 5 convention that we already know about. First of all, voting will be by state. Most likely, one vote for each state. Why? Because a convention of states is a meeting of equals. States at a convention would each have the same voting strength, similar to the way member countries in NATO or the United Nations have equal voting strength. One nation, one vote. And it's always been this way in conventions in the United States. Every interstate convention in our history has had one state, one vote. One exception to that, there was a convention in the late 1800s where each state got 8 votes. Go figure. But even in that case, no state had greater voting power than any other state. They were all equal. It was a convention of states. You get delegates from the 50 states together. Each one has one vote. The other thing we know already about the rules at the Convention of States is that every state legislature would control the process from beginning to end. There's no such thing as a runaway convention. The convention would be controlled by the state legislatures. It's a convention of the states, and each state will have its say-so. For example, Indiana and many other states have what's known as the faithful delegate law. However many delegates we send to the convention will be accountable to the Indiana General Assembly. And if they don't vote according to the instructions given them by the General Assembly, they will be subject to arrest upon return to the state and prosecution as a felon. It's a felony level law. So, it's a great myth that there are no rules for the convention. There are already some rules in place that we know about. And then when the convention meets, it will set its own rules. So don't be afraid. Don't be gaslighted. It's a very safe procedure. Okay, now to close us out, here's Marengo Mike.
Marengo Mike here with a reminder that our work to raise the bar on making our federal government accountable to the people is only halfway done. We need to grow our grassroots army of citizens every day to fulfill the vision of our forefathers and keep our land free and prosperous. So, if you have never signed the petition to show your support, use that QR code and do that now. While you're there, why not kick it up a notch and volunteer for many of the positions available where your talents can make a difference as we march into a new year. Thank you, and God bless.